March 1945. A German reconnaissance pilot banks his aircraft over the Rhine River Valley. Below him, spread across the French countryside, he sees something that makes his blood run cold. An entire American armored division, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, half-tracks, supply trucks, all staged for what looks like a major offensive. He circles lower, takes photographs, radios the coordinates back to German intelligence. Americanish Panzer Division, grid reference. Within hours, German commanders are repositioning forces, shifting reserves, preparing for the American attack. But there's a problem. The American division doesn't exist. Those tanks aren't steel. They're rubber, inflatable dummies that 4 men can carry. The artillery? Cardboard and wood. The half-tracks? Canvas stretched over frames. And the soldiers moving between them, setting up radios, building campfires, hanging laundry. They're not preparing for battle. They're staging a show, a carefully choreographed illusion designed to fool German reconnaissance. This is the Ghost Army. Officially, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, 1,100 men who fought World War II not with bullets, but with imagination, artists, designers, sound engineers, radio operators, men who turned deception into an art form, and in doing so, they may have saved 30,000 American lives. This is the story of the most creative military unit in history, a secret that was hidden for 50 years, a deception so audacious, so perfectly executed, that even decades later, military historians call it genius. This is the story of how artists deceived Hitler and changed the course of the war. This is the Ghost Army. Before they were soldiers, they were artists. Fashion designer Bill Blass, who would become one of America's most celebrated couturiers. Painter Ellsworth Kelly, who would revolutionize abstract art. Photographer Art Kane, who would shoot iconic images for Esquire and Vogue. Wildlife painter Arthur Singer. Industrial designer Harold Lehner. Sculptor George van der Sluis. These men, and hundreds like them, were recruited from art schools across America. Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, the Philadelphia Museum School of Art. Young men with talents for drawing, painting, sculpture, and design. But when World War II broke out, they faced a choice. Many enlisted, but the Army didn't know what to do with artists. Put a painter in the infantry? Train a sculptor to fire artillery? It seemed like a waste of talent. But in 1944, someone had a better idea. What if you could use artists to fight a different kind of war? A war of deception. A war where creativity was a weapon. The idea wasn't completely new. The British had used deception extensively. During the North Africa campaign, they created entire fake armies to mislead German commander Erwin Rommel. Operation Bertram, before the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, had used dummy tanks, fake supply depots, and camouflage positions to convince the Germans the attack would come from the south, when it actually came from the north. It worked brilliantly, and American military planners took notice. But the Americans wanted to take it further, create a mobile deception unit, one that could travel with the advancing armies, stage elaborate illusions, and disappear before the enemy realized they'd been fooled. To do this, they needed specialists, not just soldiers who could follow orders, but creative thinkers, problem solvers, artists, men who could look at a muddy field and see a stage, men who could build a fake tank that looked real from 500 yards away, men who understood light, shadow, perspective, and theater. And so, in January 1944, the U.S. Army activated a new unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Top secret, classified. Even most of the soldiers who joined didn't know what they'd be doing. They were told, "You're going to Europe. Special operations. Can't tell you more." Many assumed they'd be commandos, paratroopers, elite infantry. They had no idea they were about to become the greatest con artists in military history. The 23rd was divided into 4 specialized units. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion, the visual deception experts. These were the artists, the men who would build the fake tanks, paint the scenery, create the illusions. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deception Unit, sound engineers who would record and play battlefield noises to simulate troop movements. The Signal Company Special, Radio Deception, operators who would send fake radio traffic to convince German intelligence they were listening to real American units, and a small headquarters staff to coordinate operations. In total, 82 officers and 1,023 enlisted men. By Army standards, a tiny unit. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in imagination. And in the spring of 1944, they shipped out to England. Their mission, help win the war. With lies. June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. 160,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. But before a single soldier landed, the Germans had already been deceived. Operation Fortitude, the massive Allied deception plan, had convinced Hitler that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles north of Normandy. How? Fake armies, phantom divisions, inflatable tanks staged in southern England. And it worked. Even after the Normandy landings, Hitler kept divisions at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops weren't part of Operation Fortitude. They were still training, but they learned from it, studied the techniques, refined the methods, and by the time they arrived in France, weeks after D-Day, they were ready. Their first mission would be in Brittany, at the port city of Brest. Brest was a major German naval base, heavily fortified, defended by over 35,000 German troops. The U.S. 8 Corps had the job of capturing it, but they didn't have enough men to surround the city completely. If the Germans realized how thin the American lines were, they could break out. So the 8 Corps called in the Ghost Army. Make us look bigger. Make the Germans think we have 2 divisions when we only have half that. This was it, the Ghost Army's first real operation, and they had to do it while German scouts watched from the hills. The margin for error was 0. If the Germans saw through deception, if they realized the division surrounding them were inflatable props and sound effects, the entire siege could collapse. Men would die. So the Ghost Army got to work. They arrived after dark, moved into position under cover of night, and by dawn, a miracle had happened. Where yesterday there had been empty fields, now there were tank battalions, artillery parks, supply depots. From the air, from German reconnaissance planes, it looked like a massive American force had arrived overnight. But the visual deception was only part of it. The Ghost Army also used sound. At night, they positioned sound trucks near German lines and played recordings. The sounds of tanks moving, engines revving, gears grinding, treads clanking. To German sentries listening in the dark, it sounded like American armor was maneuvering, shifting positions, preparing for an assault. The Sonic Deception Unit, the 3,132nd Signal Service Company, had spent months recording sounds, real tanks, real artillery, real convoy movements. They recorded them at various distances, various acoustics, and now they played them back, perfectly synchronized with the visual deceptions. The Germans heard it, reported it. American reinforcements, heavy armor, moving into position, and the deception held. For 2 weeks, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion, and when Brest finally fell in September 1944, the Germans never realized that half the American army surrounding them had been rubber and canvas. The Ghost Army had passed its first test, but this was just the beginning. Over the next 11 months, they would stage over 20 major deceptions, each more elaborate than the last, each bringing them closer to the heart of Nazi Germany. To understand how the Ghost Army worked, you have to understand equipment and the creativity required to use it. The inflatable tanks, the iconic centerpiece of deception, were engineering marvels, designed by a company that usually made inflatable life rafts. Each tank was made of rubberized canvas, supported by inflatable tubes. Deflated, one could fit in a duffel bag. Inflated, it looked, from 500 yards away, exactly like a 30-ton Sherman tank. The process was almost absurdly simple. For men could carry a deflated tank to position, hook up an air compressor, the kind used to inflate truck tires, and in 15 minutes you had a tank. Then came the details. Real tanks leave tracks. So the Ghost Army used bulldozers to scrape fake tracks in the mud. Real tanks have exhaust, so they lit fires under dummies to create smoke. Real tank crews hang laundry, cook food, move around. So Ghost Army soldiers played tank crews, while armed with real weapons in case Germans attacked. But inflatable tanks weren't the only props. The Ghost Army had entire arsenals of fakes. Inflatable artillery pieces, howitzers, anti-aircraft guns, dummy trucks, wooden frames covered with canvas, mounted on jeeps, fake supply depots, stacks of crates empty, fuel drums empty, ammunition boxes empty, even fake landing craft, inflatable boats that from the air looked like invasion barges. Creating the illusion required artistry. Ghost Army soldiers, trained artists, would study real military units, how they arranged their vehicles, how they positioned sentries, how they organized supply areas. Then they'd recreate it, not just randomly placing props, but staging a believable military encampment, like a theater set, but one that had to fool area reconnaissance and enemy scouts. And they couldn't just set it up and leave. They had to maintain it. Real armies move. Vehicles shift position. New units arrive. Old units leave. So the Ghost Army constantly rearranged their props, moved tanks from one field to another, collapsed some dummies, and inflated new ones in different locations, all to create the impression of an active, dynamic military force. But the visual deception was only one layer. The sonic deception added another dimension. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company, the sound unit, was staffed by engineers from Bell Labs, RCA, and other technical companies. They understood acoustics, sound propagation, audio engineering, and they'd build a weapon. Portable sound systems powerful enough to be heard miles away. The sound effects library was extensive. They'd recorded tank engines starting and idling, tank columns moving on roads, half-tracks shifting gears, artillery being towed, trucks in convoy, engineers building bridges, infantry companies marching. Each sound was recorded at different distances, close up, mid-range, distant, so they could create realistic audio landscapes. In operation, the sound trucks would position themselves at night, hidden in tree lines or behind hills. Speakers aimed toward enemy positions, and at carefully calculated volumes, they'd play the sounds. Not too loud, that would be suspicious, but loud enough to carry across no man's land. German listening posts would pick up the sounds, report them to intelligence. American armor moving, estimate battalion strength, grid coordinates, and the deception would take root. The third layer was radio deception. The signal company special operated fake radio networks. Real military units generate constant radio traffic, orders, status reports, logistics coordination, weather updates. The Ghost Army's radio operators, many of them former ham radio enthusiasts, created fake radio chatter, complete with proper military codes, call signs, and procedures. They'd studied real radio procedures, learned the patterns, the rhythms, the mistakes real operators made, and they reproduced it perfectly, creating phantom divisions that existed only in radio waves. German intelligence, monitoring Allied communications, would intercept the traffic, plot the units on maps, and adjust their defensive positions accordingly, all based on conversations that were completely fabricated. And finally, there was a human element, the special effects. Ghost Army soldiers would wear the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating, visit local French towns, drink in cafes, talk to locals, drop hints about their division, knowing German spies and informants were listening. They even staged fake arguments, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "I'm telling you, we're hitting the Rhine at Cologne. No way, it's Mainz. The colonel said so." All scripted, all theater, but incredibly effective. German intelligence would collect these snippets, piece them together, and come to the exact conclusions the Ghost Army wanted them to reach. This was multimedia deception. Visual, audio, radio, human intelligence, all synchronized, all carefully timed. And when it worked, when all four layers came together, it was magic. The Germans would see an entire division where only 1,100 men stood and commit their forces to defend against a threat that didn't exist. Let's talk about the hardware. Because the Ghost Army's success depended on surprisingly simple technology, used brilliantly. The inflatable tanks, called pneumatic dummies, came in multiple types. Sherman tanks, the workhorse of the American Army. M7 pre-self-propelled guns. M10 tank destroyers. Each one carefully sculpted to match the real thing. The material was rubberized canvas, tough enough to withstand field conditions, but light enough that 4 men could carry one. Each dummy weighed about 100 pounds. Compare that to a real Sherman, 33 tons. When deflated, they packed into bags 30 inches long. When inflated, they were full size. The challenge was realism. From the ground, up close, the dummies were obviously fake. You could see the canvas seams, the inflation valves, the lightweight construction. But the Ghost Army didn't operate up close. They set up their deceptions 800 to 1,000 yards behind the front lines, far enough that German scouts couldn't get close. And from that distance, especially viewed through binoculars or from aircraft, the dummies were convincing. But details mattered. Real tanks have shadows. So Ghost Army artists studied sun angles and positioned dummies to cast proper shadows. Real tanks get muddy, so they'd splash mud on the dummies. Real tanks have wear patterns, so they'd paint scuff marks, rust stains, unit markings. This was where the artist training showed. They understood light, texture, visual composition, and they used that knowledge to create illusions that fooled German intelligence analysts studying aerial photos. The sound equipment was equally ingenious. The 3,130-second signal service company used what they called heater units. Basically, very large speakers mounted on trucks. Each unit consisted of 2 500-watt amplifiers, multiple large horn speakers, playback equipment, phonographs and later wire recorders, hundreds of feet of cable. The whole system could project sound up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. But volume wasn't the only factor. The sound had to be directional, focused toward enemy lines. So the speakers were positioned carefully, behind hills or tree lines to mask the source, aimed to bounce sound off terrain features, creating the impression that the sounds were coming from where the phantom tanks were supposedly located. The recordings themselves were masterpieces, not just random engine noises, but carefully scripted audio stories. A typical sonic deception might include 6 p.m., tank engine starting multiple units, 6:15 p.m., tanks moving into formation, 6:30 p.m., column moving on road, 15-minute sequence, 7 p.m., tanks arriving at new position, engines shutting down, 7:30 p.m., maintenance sounds, tools, welding, generators, all timed, all realistic, all designed to tell a story of military movement. German listening posts would hear this progression and report American armor relocating, moving from Sector A to Sector B, estimated strength battalion. Exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to think. The radio deception was perhaps the most technical. Radio operators had to understand military communication procedures, proper radio etiquette, unit call signs and codes, encryption patterns, typical traffic volume for different unit sizes. They created entire phantom divisions, complete with division headquarters, 3 infantry regiments, artillery battalions, support units, medical companies, supply trains. Each unit generated appropriate radio traffic, not constant chatter. That would be suspicious. But the normal ebb and flow of military communication, morning reports, supply requisitions, weather checks, password updates, all fake, all coordinated, all believable. And here's the brilliant part. The Ghost Army would often represent real divisions, A real division would be pulled from the line for rest and refit. The Ghost Army would move in and take over their radio call signs. Continue transmitting as if the division was still there. Meanwhile, the real division, now silent, would move to a different sector to launch a surprise attack. The Germans would think the division was in one place when it was actually 50 miles away. This combination, visual, sonic, radio, and human deception, was called special effects. And when all four worked together, the results were extraordinary. German intelligence would receive aerial photos showing tanks and vehicles, radio intercepts indicating unit strength and movement, acoustic reports of armor movement, human intelligence from spies confirming unit identities, all pointing to the same conclusion, a conclusion that was completely false. But the Ghost Army wasn't invulnerable. They operated close to enemy lines. German patrols could stumble onto them. Artillery fire could hit them. And if the Germans captured a tank intact, the deception would be exposed. So every operation carried risk. And the Ghost Army's greatest weapon, besides their props, was speed. Set up fast. Execute. Get out before the enemy could investigate. September 1944. After the Brest operation, the Ghost Army moved east with the advancing Allied armies. Next target, the German border. Operation Viersen. The mission: convince the Germans that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to attack near Viersen, on the Roer River. In reality, the Ninth Army was consolidating forces 20 miles south. The Ghost Army moved into position on September 15th. They set up a massive deception. Over 100 inflatable tanks, dozens of dummy artillery pieces, fake supply depots, and round-the-clock sonic and radio deception, all designed to look like the Ninth Army was massing for a river crossing. The Germans took the bait. They repositioned artillery to cover the fake crossing point, moved infantry reserves, strengthened defenses, all focused on the wrong location. Meanwhile, the real Ninth Army prepared to attack elsewhere. But then, things got dangerous. On September 18th, German artillery opened fire on the Ghost Army position, not probing fire. Heavy bombardment, shells landing among the inflatable tanks. The rubber dummies absorbed shrapnel, deflated, some caught fire, but the Ghost Army soldiers were in foxholes, and miraculously, no one was killed. The bombardment actually helped the deception. The Germans saw their shells hitting tanks, saw explosions, saw destruction. They assumed they'd inflicted casualties on a real unit. German intelligence reported, successful fire mission, American armor position heavily damaged, and the Ghost Army, under fire but unhurt, kept operating. Operation Viersen lasted 6 days, and it worked. When the real Ninth Army attacked, 20 miles south of where the Germans expected, they met lighter resistance. German reserves had been pulled north. Artillery had been repositioned, all because of the Ghost Army's illusion. Estimated Allied casualties saved 1,000 men, but the Ghost Army paid a price. They'd lost equipment. Some men were wounded by shell fragments, and they'd learned a hard lesson. Deception operations weren't safe. They were operating in artillery range, sometimes just 1,000 yards from German lines. They were targets, and unlike real combat units, they couldn't shoot back. Their only defense was the illusion itself. Between deception operations, the Ghost Army soldiers remained artists. They carried sketchbooks, watercolors, cameras, and they documented the war. They sketched destroyed villages, painted portraits of fellow soldiers, photographed the landscapes of war. Some of this was for intelligence purposes, documenting enemy positions, terrain features. But much of it was simply art, a way to process what they were experiencing, a way to remain human in the midst of war. Bill Blass, who would become one of America's greatest fashion designers, spent his evenings designing dresses. Ellsworth Kelly painted abstract compositions inspired by camouflage patterns. Art Kane took thousands of photographs that would later hang in galleries. These men were warriors who refused to stop being artists. And that duality, that insistence on beauty in the midst of destruction, define the Ghost Army spirit. But they also use their art for the mission. Ghost Army artists would create fake shoulder patches, design fake unit insignias, paint fake signs pointing to headquarters of phantom divisions, create fake notices and orders that could be accidentally left for German spies to find. They even created fake newspapers, unit newsletters that mentioned upcoming operations, complete with inside jokes, sports scores, letters from home. All fake, all carefully crafted to seem real, and then accidentally distributed in towns where German spies operated. This attention to narrative, to storytelling, was what made the Ghost Army unique. They didn't just build props. They created entire fictional worlds, complete with history, characters, and plots. And then they performed those stories for an audience that was trying to kill them. They gave their fake divisions personalities. The tough division, the by-the-book division, the green division that made rookie mistakes. And they played those characters consistently, in radio traffic, in behavior, in the way they set up camps. Method acting, on a battlefield. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, but captured in unit records, of a Ghost Army soldier who was challenged by a drunk French civilian. You're not a real tank crew. Where's your tank? The Ghost Army soldier led him to an inflatable dummy. In the dark, from 20 feet away, the Frenchman couldn't tell. He apologized profusely, and the soldier bought him another drink. But the real test wasn't fooling drunk civilians. It was fooling German intelligence. Professional military analysts trained to spot deceptions. And as the Ghost Army moved deeper into Europe, as the operation became more complex, the stakes got higher, because by late 1944, the Allies were preparing for the biggest deception of all. November 1944, the Allies were pushing toward the German industrial heartland. The U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, was preparing to attack the heavily fortified city of Metz. But Metz was a nightmare. Ancient fortress, modern fortifications, surrounded by rivers. The Germans expected Patton to attack from the west, so Patton decided to surprise them, attack from the south. But to do that, he needed to keep the Germans looking west. He needed the Ghost Army. Operation Bougainville was the Ghost Army's most ambitious deception yet. They would impersonate two entire divisions, the 90th Infantry Division and the 87th Infantry Division, make it look like 30,000 troops were massing west of Metz, while the Real divisions moved south for the surprise attack. The Ghost Army deployed over 150 inflatable tanks, dozens of artillery pieces, hundreds of vehicles. It was the largest visual deception they'd ever attempted, and they did it in 6 days. But visual wasn't enough. They ran constant sonic deceptions, playing sound to two divisions, moving into position, bridge construction, artillery emplacement, tank movements. 8 hours every night. Radio traffic was intense. The Ghost Army operators transmitted hundreds of messages per day, mimicking two division networks. Supply requests, casualty reports, weather observations, all coordinated, all consistent, and they added personal touches. Ghost Army soldiers, wearing 90th Division patches, flooded the nearby town of Bougainville, drinking, talking, complaining about their officers. Yeah, we're hitting Metz next week. From the west. Gonna be a bloodbath. Knowing German informants were listening. The Germans bought it completely. They detected the buildup west of Metz, reinforced those sectors, moved artillery, positioned reserves, all focused on the wrong direction. And on November 8th, Patton attacked from the south. The attack achieved total surprise. German forces scrambled to reposition, but by then it was too late. Patton's troops broke through, and Metz, a fortress that had never been taken by assault in over 1,500 years, fell to the Americans in 2 weeks. Estimated casualties saved by the Ghost Army, 2,000 men, but the Ghost Army almost paid dearly. On November 11th, 3 days after the real attack began, German patrols stumbled onto a Ghost Army position. They got close enough to see the inflatable tanks, close enough to realize something was wrong. A firefight erupted. The Ghost Army, armed with rifles and machine guns for self-defense, fought back. The German patrol was driven off, but it was close. Too close. If that German patrol had escaped to report what they'd seen, if they'd told their commanders about the rubber tanks, the entire deception would have been compromised, future operations ruined, but the patrol was wiped out before they could report. And the secret held. This was the reality of Ghost Army operations. They weren't combat troops, but they operated in combat zones. And sometimes the war came to them. March 1945. The Allies had reached the Rhine River, the last natural barrier protecting Germany. Crossing it would be one of the most dangerous operations of the war. Rivers favor defenders. Attackers are vulnerable. And the Germans knew the Allies were coming. The U.S. Ninth Army planned to cross the Rhine near the town of Viersen, but they needed a diversion, something big enough to pull German reserves away from the real crossing point. Once again, they called the Ghost Army. We need you to stage the biggest show you've ever done. Operation Viersen, not to be confused with the earlier operation near the same town, would be the Ghost Army's masterpiece. They would simulate 2 entire corps preparing to cross the Rhine. That's 4 divisions, over 60,000 men, represented by 1,100 Ghost Army soldiers, and inflatable tanks. They set up the largest fake military concentration of the war. Over 200 inflatable tanks, 100 plus dummy artillery pieces, fake supply dumps covering acres, inflatable landing craft positioned as if preparing for amphibious assault, all visible from German observation posts across the Rhine. The sonic deception was unprecedented. They ran 24-hour operations, sounds of bridge construction, engineering units at work, tanks moving into position, landing craft engines, infantry assembling, all blasted toward German lines. Radio traffic was constant. They simulated 2 corps headquarters, 8 division networks, dozens of subordinate units, thousands of transmissions, all fake, all coordinated, creating the electronic signature of a massive army preparing to attack. And the human deception was everywhere. Ghost Army soldiers, wearing patches from all 4 divisions, flooded nearby towns. They talked about the crossing, argued about which sector would go first, leaked information about boat training, maps of crossing sites, casualty estimates. All theater, all scripted. The Germans were convinced. They detected a massive American force, identified all 4 divisions, tracked their supposed movements, and shifted reserves north to defend against the crossing they were certain was coming. On March 23rd, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, not at Viersen, where the Ghost Army was staging their show, but 20 miles south. The Germans were caught off balance. Reserves were in the wrong place. Artillery was sighted to cover the wrong crossing points. And the real attack succeeded with minimal casualties. It was the Ghost Army's greatest achievement. They deceived an entire German army, pulled reserves away from the critical point, and enabled one of the most successful river crossings of the war. Estimated casualties saved 3,000 to 5,000 men, but it almost went wrong. On March 24th, the day after the real crossing, German artillery opened up on the Ghost Army position. Massive bombardment. They'd realized they'd been tricked, and they were furious. For 3 hours, shells rained down. Inflatable tanks were shredded. Equipment was destroyed. But the Ghost Army soldiers, dug into foxholes and trenches, survived. 3 men were wounded, none killed. And by nightfall, they'd packed up and moved out, leaving behind only rubber scraps and German fury. The Ghost Army operated in constant danger. They weren't frontline combat troops, but they worked within artillery range of enemy forces, often just 1,000 yards from German lines, and they had minimal firepower, rifles, a few machine guns, some bazookas, enough for self-defense, but not enough to fight a real battle. There were close calls throughout their service. In October 1944, near Treves, a German patrol got within 300 yards of the Ghost Army position before being spotted. A firefight erupted. The Germans were driven off, but they'd seen the inflatable tanks. Fortunately, they were killed before they could report. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army was rushed forward to help stabilize the line. They weren't staging deceptions. They were filling gaps, acting as actual infantry. For 2 weeks, they held positions as a real combat unit. Several men were wounded. One was killed. It was the only Ghost Army combat death of the war. Private First Class Arthur C. Shilstone, artist, sculptor, soldier, killed by German sniper fire near Echternach, Luxembourg. He was 22 years old. His death was a stark reminder. The Ghost Army's illusions didn't make them immune to real bullets. There was also the constant risk of exposure. If German reconnaissance had captured inflatable tanks intact, if they discovered the truth about the Ghost Army, future deceptions would have been impossible. So the Ghost Army developed emergency procedures. If overrun, destroy all equipment, burn the inflatable tanks, smash the sound equipment, shoot holes in the dummies, leave nothing for the Germans to study. Thankfully, they never had to use those procedures, but the threat was always there, and it added psychological pressure to every operation. They were performers, on a stage, with live ammunition. Despite the dangers, morale remained high. These men believed in their mission. They knew they were saving lives. Real soldiers, infantrymen, tankers, who might have died were surviving because of Ghost Army deceptions. That knowledge kept them going, and there was dark humor. When artillery hit inflatable tanks, Ghost Army soldiers would hold funerals, saluting the fallen rubber dummies, playing taps. It was their way of coping, laughing at death, because what else could they do? May 8th, 1945, V-Day, victory in Europe. The war was over. The Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major deception operations. From Normandy to the Rhine, they'd impersonated entire divisions, fooled German intelligence repeatedly, and helped save an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. But as the celebrations erupted, as soldiers shared stories of battles fought and friends lost, the Ghost Army stayed silent. Their operations were classified, top secret. They were ordered not to discuss what they'd done, not with other soldiers, not with family, not with anyone. The inflatable tanks were destroyed. The sound trucks were dismantled. The records were locked away. And the Ghost Army disappeared. The soldiers went home, back to their art studios, their design firms, their galleries. Bill Blass became a fashion legend. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's greatest abstract artists. Art Kane photographed the most famous jazz musicians of the 1950s. But none of them could talk about the Ghost Army. For 50 years, the Ghost Army remained classified. Military historians knew something had happened. References appeared in German intelligence reports. But the full story was hidden. Until 1996. When the Ghost Army files were finally declassified, the story stunned the world. A secret unit of artists who'd fought with fake tanks and sound effects? It sounded like fiction, but it was real, and the veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, could finally tell their stories. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Museums hosted Ghost Army exhibitions. The inflatable tanks, a few that survived in storage, were displayed. And the public learned about one of the most creative military operations in history. In February 2022, 77 years after the war ended, the Ghost Army finally received official recognition. Congress awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor America can bestow. By then, fewer than 10 Ghost Army veterans were still alive, but they attended the ceremony, and they were honored. The citation read, for their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations during World War II. Unique, that was the right word, because there's never been another unit like the Ghost Army, before or since. Their legacy lives on in military doctrine. Deception operations are now standard. Modern armies use radar decoys, electronic warfare, cyber deception, but the Ghost Army pioneered the concept. That creativity can be as powerful as firepower. That imagination can save lives. That artists can be warriors. But perhaps the most important legacy is the art. The Ghost Army veterans, those who survived, went on to shape American culture. Bill Blass dressed first ladies and Hollywood stars. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings hang in the world's greatest museums. Art Kane's photographs define an era, and dozens of others, designers, sculptors, illustrators, enriched American life. They prove that artists aren't just decorators. They're problem solvers, strategic thinkers, creative warriors. And in World War II, they helped save the world. Not with guns, with imagination. Today, you can visit Ghost Army exhibits across America, see the inflatable tanks, hear the recordings, read the stories. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear the ghosts, the artists who became soldiers, the soldiers who never stopped being artists, the 1,100 men who deceived an empire and saved thousands of lives. With nothing but rubber, canvas, sound, and imagination, the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, artists who became the greatest deceivers of World War II. They didn't fire many shots, but they won battles. They didn't command divisions, but they impersonated them. They didn't march in parades, but they were heroes. This is their story, a story that was hidden for half a century, a story of creativity, courage, and deception, a story that proves sometimes the pen and the paintbrush really are mightier than the sword.